So let's rock and roll. So we're going to zoom out a little bit and hit on some very high level, more is what I'm calling insider information today. So navigating the funding landscape, there's a lot out there, right? How do we really tackle that landscape strategically? Aligning grant maker and applicant priorities, super important for success. Understanding the process, so what are those barriers, challenges, and opportunities to move forward? And then creating this network of support. So always good to think about who you're bringing up around you and involving in your process. So there's going to be three things we want you to get out of this conversation today. One, that you're empowered. You've got a basic understanding of grants from whatever angle you're coming from. It is not that scary, we promise. Get creative, thinking expansively about what is available in terms of funding. It's not just about, bipartisan infrastructure law and Inflation Reduction Act funding. There's a lot of other sources out there for you guys to think about, and then engage. So you can have a say in how these funds get used from a variety of different organizations. There's a lot of ways to plug in. So definitely do that and use your voice. So we're going to dive in with navigating the funding landscape. So there's many different sources of grant funding out there from government and non-government sectors. But Joel, how would you describe the funding breakdown between federal, subnational, so state or local, and philanthropic or NGO grants? And how can prospective applicants best navigate this complex landscape, especially as it is changing as we speak?
Sure. With most of you being for-profit companies, you're going to be looking at, or primarily at, federal and state grants. A lot of those philanthropic and private grant funding, foundations and whatnot, they're primarily going to be giving their funding to nonprofits. So as nice as it would be to get some of that funding, that's not really going to be where you want to spend your time. Federal grants, they're going to be available to anyone with a project in the U.S. or U.S. territory. State grants, it depends, state to state. They're all different.
Yeah, and I would just add so when we talk about federal grants, and minor caveat here, I am not speaking on behalf of EPA today, nor am I speaking on behalf of the U.S. government. EPA, with that said, does award approximately 1/2 of its budget annually in assistance agreements. So that's competitive, non-competitive grants, and competitive agreements, AKA they're just all grants. That's a lot of money. And that could be to grantees, including states, tribes, local governments, educational institutions, nonprofits, really dependent on the program that you're looking into. Most of those are what we call formulaic. So they go directly to states for further distribution. That is why it's so important when you're thinking about, you see federal policy coming out, you want to look at how that's translated down to the state in which you are operating or working, because that state is receiving those fundings and they're turning it into something very different, potentially. So for example, coming from a decade of working in water policy, clean water and drinking water SRFs, or state revolving funds, right? It's really powerful state-federal partnership that gives grants and forgivable loans at the state level. And that can be for a wide range of uses in the water space, for capacity building, so pre-development activities, source water protection, habitat restoration, water efficiency and reuse, energy efficiency. And then as another really great example for formulaic funding is our state 319 grants, or non-point source grants, right? So that tackles everything from soil health, wildfire mitigation, nutrient reduction, water recharge. That has a lot of resonance and applicability to biochar.
Yeah, and that makes me think, one way too that you should approach grant funding is not necessarily looking funding directly for your project. That's available for the equipment purchase, the installation, and whatnot. If you need, for example, I heard one of the speakers mention a $5 million power line coming to your facility. You can partner with your local government or one of the economic development organizations in your area. They may be eligible to apply for one of these grants, which is going to help pay for that utility work. And so you can help bring in these resources for your greenfield or brownfield project to help get those things paid for, even though it's not necessarily a grant to you.
That is a really great point. And other things to think about are, at what stage are you with your company or your project? Is it research and development? Are you in those pre-development activities like planning and staff training, et cetera? Because there will be grants that are vastly different for those types of activities. Unfortunately, they tend to be a little bit more uncommon depending on the program versus others that are really about full force implementation. One last thing just to mention, our nonprofit partners and community-based organizations or philanthropy, like Joel mentioned earlier, is compared to government, they're just way more agile and kind of creative beasts when it comes to developing grant programs, and what those funds can be used for, and their processes look very different if it's not kind of pass-through funding, right, that's coming from a federal entity. So definitely be sure to look into those opportunities too where you're working. So we talked about the funding landscape. I want to move into matching grant maker and applicant priorities. So grant programs often reflect the priorities of the organization that is providing them. Given that, Joel, what advice would you offer to applicants that are sifting between federal and state level grants, as well as from community-based or regional organizations? And what's the benefit of staying close to home?
Sure. My best advice when it comes to looking at grant programs is to slow down and read carefully. When talking to the program coordinators at the Wood Innovations program, they'll tell you the number one reason applications are rejected is because they missed something in the application, or they just plain weren't eligible for it. So organizations, you can save so much time and effort just by slowing down, reading those NOFOs, and really being brutally honest with yourself. Does my project line up with what the funder is looking for? It's not like a business deal where you get 80% there and we can kind of fudge around and come to an agreement. If there's one small detail where you don't line up with their requirements, your application will get thrown out. That's just how it works. What was the second part of that question?
The regional aspect, if you want to hit on that.
The regional aspect. In terms of federal grants, they're, as long as I said, in the U.S. territory, you are eligible for them. However, there can be a regional aspect in that some areas of the U.S. probably you're going to have more competition than others. In the U.S. Southeast, huge forest basket, and so there's going to be more competition for any sort of dollars going toward forest product projects. Whereas if you're doing something somewhere else, there won't be as much competition. However, there's may not be as much feedstock somewhere else. So that comes into play as well. When it comes to local grants, again, it really depends. A lot of those foundations, if you can get foundational support, that's fantastic. It's a lot easier to get those. However, there has to be that charitable purpose or driver behind what you're doing that you got to get folks on board.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you for bringing in the regional aspect. I'm going to go same kind of top down with you. So there's definitely benefits to looking at grants within your region of the country versus federal. Now, some people might not love that, but that's my truth. But the heavy hitters that you want to look at the federal level, definitely USDA, DOE, EPA, SBA. I would say are the pretty big ones, if I'm not missing. FEMA, I would absolutely look into them as well. But really, it's about your needs aligning with that agency, right? So looking at the initial sections of that grant solicitation. So first of all, federal grants are always going to be laid out basically in the same way, right? And so if you look at the initial sections that talk about program goals and objectives, they really set the stage to highlight those core statutory or regulatory requirements, federal and agency-wide priorities and policies. priority projects that are eligible, so they will often state those right at the get-go. For example, with Inflation Reduction Act, there was a clear through line with Clean Air Act, with the community change grants, and then bringing up that government-wide goal of the Justice 40 policy that was there at the time. All of that was very clearly stated in the beginning, and it can kind of be your litmus test of, do I want to proceed with this further? Is it really worth my time and my resources? Priority projects, really important section to look at too. I don't mean eligible projects, I mean priority projects, so they are different. You want to think about how you're maximizing co-benefits with your project. You might be applying to a grant that is for water quality improvement, but that's not kind of the main thrust of your project. I wouldn't rule yourself out of the running for that, right? So what are the co-benefits of your projects that you can really think about expansively to get that additional cash flow and that funding coming in? This is also a good way to see how feds are ranking those priority projects. There might be some projects that they're looking at or hoping to kind of get in the hopper over others. And so that's going to weigh in, especially if it's competitive and there is evaluation criteria that are related. And then set-asides or separate tracks of funding. So often there will be a set-aside in a grant that is just for a specific demographic or a specific type of project, and that is golden. For example, the Virginia's Clean Water State Revolving Fund literally has a set-aside just for living shorelines. It's super cool. So states do get very creative like that, and you can tap into that funding. Regionally based grants reflect regional needs. So they offer these really collaborative frameworks, they offer diverse partnerships, and they really resonate with local priorities. So lots of federal agencies will have regional offices, and for example, with EPA, they have 10. There's Urban Waters Program grants, the National Estuary Program grants, and Geographic Program grants. And those are all great ways to say, okay, how can I tap into supporting the priorities that are local or regional? And there's a lot of really innovative grant programs that are happening in those spaces. Think Puget Sound Partnership or Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, where we are right now. And even Gulf Hypoxia Program had a farmer-to-farmer grant that came out a couple of years ago, which was super cool. It went right to farmers for doing innovative technologies or applications for non-point source control. So that is just one I wanted to mention.
Yeah, and I'll add a few things to that. Adding on to the regional perspective, another nice thing about working, at the state level or the local level is that you're able to form those relationships much easier with the funders than you can at the federal level, and those can be really important. I've known a lot of projects where they've been able to get their state senator or the governor to back their project, and even though they're not making the decision, that letter of support does mean something when they're coming to review that project. When you get to the federal level, it's really difficult, if not impossible, to have that sort of relationship with the funders. It's harder for them to know you personally. I also suggest for that reason, no matter federal or state or philanthropic, reach out to the funders and talk to them before you apply. It's really good if they know you're applying and they can look at that ahead of time instead of it just, okay, who is this? Having no idea who you are and it just kind of being a surprise on their desk.
Mm-hmm. And that is such a good transition into what you hit on a little bit earlier with talking about understanding the process, but from a key challenges and barriers perspective. So grants are often criticized, right, as time confusing or consuming, confusing, resource intensive. What are those primary barriers that we're seeing that applicants face over the grant life cycle? So not just with navigating, not just with applying, but actually managing long term. And then how do those challenges differ depending on the stage of a company in terms of readiness?
Sure, this is a really good topic because I speak with folks all the time who are really excited to talk about grants because they just see the free money and they don't think about the cost associated with it. Even grants come with a cost. and it is really worth considering before you apply to these, especially when it comes to the state, especially with the federal level, because they are time intensive. With the federal grants, I mean, you need to track everything, every dime, every penny you spend. If you're tracking, if personnel costs are part of your budget, you need to track time. And they're very serious about everything being in perfect order, especially now. I mean, I'm sure you've heard about some of the challenges and some of the issues going on with grant funding and with the federal government. You just don't want to stand out in any sort of negative way because there is a higher potential right now that your project could get red flagged and that funding be pulled. And you don't want that to happen. So you need to be on your A game, and it does take time. It takes resources to apply and to manage these grants on the back end.
Mm-hmm. And I would add, from the perspective of my prior work and also specifically running this project that unfortunately never came to final fruition. However, what I did have to do for it was interview about 15 federal agencies. And the question that I asked every single one of them was, why do applicants fail? When you get an application on your side and you're reviewing, why are people being disqualified? Why aren't they getting the money? There were two common questions. One, they're applying and they're ineligible. So they can't move forward. And the other piece was even before something hits their desk of they just don't know what's available. And so people kind of give up at the outset instead of being able to apply. So that navigation piece is really important, but it's also about meeting all of the application requirements, right? There's mandatory documents on occasion that are outside of the general application process. You might be running into pre-development issues if you need to showcase, for example, that you have a community engagement or benefits plan and you haven't prepared that prior to going to apply for the grant. So I think it's really important to even in the very beginning of your process, start spotting those grants that you want to apply to and take a look at that solicitation and say, okay, I'm checking my own readiness. Do I have all my ducks in a row so when this comes up on the next cycle, I'll be ready to kind of put the main materials together? Joel, do you want to jump in?
Yes. Yeah, looking at the grants early, super important. Another reason is because grants, they often run on a cycle. So let's say you finally feel like you're ready to apply for a grant, you start looking, you may have missed a deadline. It may have been a week, a month before, and they're not going to open that grant for another year. Mm-hmm. So knowing ahead of time when these grants are going to run can be really helpful in your planning for your project.
Mm-hmm. And that will definitely help with the reporting requirements piece, getting those cycles for reporting in place early on, having those metrics that you're thinking about, what can I effectively collect, and how am I going to get that data? Other things to think about are definitions for terms used in the grant. This can get really tricky, right? I'm sure you've heard a lot of people throw around the term resiliency. Well, resiliency can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And so making sure, as silly as it sounds, to look at that definitions and terms that are provided, really, really important to make sure that you and the grant officer are speaking the same language.
And with federal grants, there's also terms you want to avoid. When DOJ did their thing at with the grants department, they have a system now where the grants are first automatically scanned and reviewed by computer software, and if they contain any number of words, they automatically get flagged for review. Mm-hmm. If they contain multiple words that they don't like, it might just get thrown out. That's something you can search and just find online, that list. But there's also words that you want to avoid simply because, I'm not sure why, but you don't want to use those words, like women.
Oh boy.
Yeah.
We went there. Okay, so I will just say, last but not least, eligible projects. I know I hammered on this earlier from a standpoint of priority projects, but again, thinking about, as an example, Gulf of Mexico Division's Healthy and Resilient Gulf of Mexico program, right? This is a grant. I have no idea what its status is right now, but it was for multi-use conservation and restoration, flood mitigation, community planning, adaptation, nature-based resilience, et cetera. Like, you can fit a Mack truck in these types of eligible projects, right? So again, don't kind of take yourself out of the running. I would think about your project and the goals and what it's trying to do from an output and outcome standpoint. That would be in line with that opportunity. And again, just mandatory documents. Sometimes you're going to be asked for a project area map, a specific plan that relates to the intent of the funding announcement, a summary of expertise. Yes, they might ask for resumes and things like that to make sure your team is kind of ready to deploy, and even risk assessments. So definitely make sure that you're thinking about those as well. So now that we've talked about the challenges, I want to move into optimizing what success looks like and ways to improve your success rate. So what should applicants be considering before, during, and after they've applied? And what mistakes can be easily avoided? I know we talked about that earlier, so maybe just digging into pieces of a grant, a solicitation that are particularly advantageous for success.
Sure. When it comes to success and grants, I would say the first thing is make sure you're not in any way looking for grants to apply to and then tweaking your business plan to meet those requirements of that grant. I mean, first and foremost, you need to make decisions that are going to make sense for your project and business in the long run. That being said, there are some states with more opportunities than others. Mm-hmm. New York, for example, has 7 different grant programs that could apply to biochar projects, whether that's application, research, billing facility, whatnot. California has 6, Massachusetts has 4. And there are certain things within those states and which are important and that can help weigh in positively in a federal grant. So things like building your facility in an area with high unemployment, building on Indian land, building in an area that's rural. Those sort of things are going to help bolster your application. Stephanie mentioned co-benefits, and that's exactly right. The more impacts your projects have. For example, if you're doing something with your syngas instead of just using it for process heat, that's potential for more impacts, potentially more grant funding. That will help. But you need to do what's right for your business first and foremost.
Mm-hmm. One piece of a grant solicitation that I wanted to mention first in regards to success is threshold eligibility criteria. So we talked a little bit about eligibility writ large, but this really is the first screen that you're going to be put through that's different from evaluation criteria or project eligibility. And it may contain specific aspects like if you are a public or a private entity, like easy distinction to make, right? Targeted areas for activities, like Joel just mentioned. Are you on tribal lands? Are you in rural communities or disadvantaged communities? There are definitions that are written into statute. So if you're moving from program to program and you're like, I don't know why this is not the same, it's because the actual law language that it's coming from is defined differently. So please pay attention to that. And then even details on contractor selection processes or eligibility of subrecipients. If you're the principal on a grant, but you have partners coming in or subs, how those requirements will flow down to the partners that you're working with. So everybody, in normal circumstances, everybody has to follow the same rules, right? I mentioned set-asides earlier. I think a great like classic example of this that I know and love very, very well under the Clean Water State Revolving Fund is the Green Project Reserve. It's been around since 2009. It requires that every subnational state revolving fund program has a proportion of their federal grant for projects that are specific to green infrastructure, water, energy efficiency, or other environmentally innovative activities. It is a great way to work through and get federal funding, in my perspective, at a state level.
And at the federal level, a set aside that applies to you with the Wood Innovations Program, the Community Wood Grant specifically, 75% of those funds are supposed to go to thermally led projects. Biochar falls under that definition. Great news for you is that they have never met that threshold. Every single year they've had to go back to Congress and get approval for a different percentage because they've not gotten enough applicants. That means biochar projects are extremely competitive for this community wood grant.
Which is why you might want to think about diversifying that grant portfolio, because I do see, you know, when we talk about biochar and the biochar community, we are talking a lot about USDA, we're talking about a lot about DOE, and I think that's fantastic, and I'm very happy that biochar is getting significant mention in those programs, but there, like I said, there are a lot of other federally appropriated grants that are out there that you're eligible for, and even better, I think, at the state level too. So other things to think about in this category for success evaluation criteria, it's like at the very end of the document, you don't want to wait to the very end of the document to look at it. It's literally under a competitive process how you're going to be scored and how that specific part of the grant you're going to be weighted on, right? So it could say, you know, we want you to create a community engagement plan. Well, out of 100 points, that could be 25 points of how your application is going to be scored. So please make sure that you do take a look at that. A good example from a regional perspective is Puget Sound program. So that's, again, one of our geographic programs. They had in their request for applications, a very specific call for explaining how those grants meet resilience and environmental justice considerations, and that's reflected in their work plan specifically. So they will be there to kind of help you tailor where your priorities are. We talked about measuring results and reporting. Federal agencies are required to put in grants that applicants outline environmental outputs and outcomes, sometimes social, sometimes economical as well, as part of their plan for reporting, and that has got to be front-loaded in your application. Sometimes they will be very nice and have ideas provided for what those metrics can be, which is great, and I encourage you to kind of copy-paste that. But definitely think about those project outcomes and outputs and what your data collection capacity is going to be. And last but not least, kind of moving into our last topic area here, read the fact sheets, go to the information sessions, ask all the questions that you want, and find your local service center or TA provider. There are so many resources for pre-applicants to tap into to get a ton of clarity and to make that ultimate decision about whether or not that grant is right for you. So encourage you full force to take advantage of those resources.
Yeah, absolutely. Many federal grants, you know, they're going to have those Q&A sessions, live webinars where you can get additional information. I found that folks at the USDA, they're very accommodating, easy to get in touch with. They'll be honest with you whether your program passes muster, and they encourage you to apply or not. Mm-hmm. So again, speak with the funders, focus on that relational aspect of things.
Mm-hmm. On that last note, creating a network of support and speaking on the advice we would offer to grant seekers when it comes to engaging with and building the right support network. And I think this is a good segue into that. We're ending on a high note. I kept my promise. For me, I think stakeholder engagement early and often, right? You hear that a lot, but it is so true. Stakeholder engagement is so critical before, during, and after that solicitation is released and you've applied, and then you're receiving that funding. So listening sessions, holding requests for information, training webinars, things like that. Are great to make sure that you're getting the right feedback, and then also on the programmatic side that they're also allowing space for you to provide that feedback about what you want to see in the design of that grant.
Mm-hmm. And stakeholders include suppliers who are providing you with the feedstock,
Mm-hmm.
those you might have offtake agreements with, or who are simply interested in purchasing your product. Local government officials, the mayor, all these people have a stake in what you're doing, and so getting letters of support from them, that can be huge in showing that your project has a good network behind it.
Mm-hmm. And then finally, technical assistance or TA providers at the federal and state and even philanthropic and NGO levels. For navigating those opportunities, for hands-on application development, for thinking about post-award management, if you want somebody to be a thought partner with you in that process. At the federal level, for EPA, there's the Water TA program. We have environmental finance centers. Those have been alive and well for years and years. And even the Water Infrastructure and Resilience Finance Center. So those folks will really sit down with you, help you think through not only what the application looks like, but talk about the financing of your asset or your project. So really, again, great regional resources to tap into. And I would also encourage folks to, when you're looking at a grant announcement, if there are specific technical assistance tools that are mentioned there, like EPA's How's My Waterway, which you can put in your zip code, you can put in a body of water that you're interested in, et cetera. It will pull up all this data in map form of where the issues are, where the projects are, what the water quality standards are like, and what the water quality is. And things like that just help you get a better sense of how to cite your project and talk about your project in kind of a bigger context of what that program's highlighting through the grant. Okay.
Maybe one question?
Sure, yeah. Yes.
Yeah, if I could. So you mentioned the state revolving fund and the set-asides. I've actively explored the use of that for outdoor recreation projects that have an ecosystem benefit.
Mm-hmm.
And the reality is some states like Ohio are very on board to do creative things. And some states like Wisconsin are like, eh. And some states like in Arkansas are like, no. You know, it really comes down to the administrator at that level. So it's not all like hunky-dory. So my question is for Joel. You mentioned the community wood grant. Does it apply to private enterprise? Are partners needed? And what's the nuance about assessing that funding that's specifically for the thermal projects? Is it as nuanced and varied as kind of these set-asides in the state revolving fund? Or is it more straightforward than that?
Yeah, that's a good question. It is fairly straightforward. You know, they consider biochar one of these thermal projects because they can either create process heat or you can use the heat to create electricity. That's just the way they categorize it. You had a lot to your question, so.
Yeah, I was providing more context about, right, like Stephanie mentioning a particular grant or a funding source that's not a grant, but a loan, a forgivable loan of some kind.
Could be both.
Right, yeah, it could be both. And then kind of like connected to that was this idea of this other funding source that's being underutilized. I wasn't sure to what extent that was being administered as a pass-through at the state level, and whether there's nuance at the administration of that funding source at the state level. So someone who's here from Minnesota might be like, sweet, I got a great relationship, they're on board with it. Someone from South Dakota and that grant or that funding source might be like, yeah, I mean, in theory, but not really.
Okay, I understand. No, that's administered at the national level, so it doesn't matter whether you're in a blue state or red state, purple state. What the local politics are. It's just going to be a central office, folks from the U.S. Forest Service who are looking these over. So that sort of super hyper local or regional aspect is not really going to play into that.
But I will say too, with the SRFs at the state level, they are required to consult, right, to develop that priority projects pipeline. And so what happens is that the same cast of characters comes back every year to tell the same story. And so that is why I'm like, if you can get in that room, if you can create those grantee-grantor relationships, that's why that's so important, because that is what is going to change how those projects get funded.
All right, thank you.
And we're happy to chat afterward too. Thank you guys so much for your time.